Diplomacy, the Donald style. Swooping into Switzerland, then sauntering from his armada of helicopters, destined for a conference hall full of global elites and expectant heads of state, wondering if the next 90 minutes may shape the standing world order for years to come. This was the speech the whole of Davos had been waiting for, not just the party faithful. And it started with a broadside to the continent hosting him.
I love Europe, and I want to see Europe go good, but it's not heading in the right direction.
Then to what bated breath was waiting on, Greenland.
I'm seeking immediate negotiations to once again discuss the acquisition of Greenland by the United States. What I'm asking for is a piece of ice, cold and poorly located, that can play a vital role in world peace and world protection. It's a very small ask compared to what we have given them for many, many decades.
The sales pitch done from the dealmaker-in-chief, then to what counts for an olive branch in this president's parlance.
We probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. But I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good. That's probably the biggest statement I made, because people thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. All the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland. They have a choice. You can say yes, and we will be very appreciative, or you can say no, and we will remember.
Ended with a thinly veiled threat or not, taking troops off the table is a move welcomed by members of Trump's own party.
Very happy. Force is off the table, bad idea. Compelling case that we need Greenland for the common defense, not just for national security of America, but internationally.
And the Danish foreign minister, who waited mere minutes after President Trump finished to march to a microphone.
Og det der vel står ganske klart efter den her tale.
What was quite clear after this speech is that President Trump's ambition is intact. Of course, it is positive that he said that he will not use military force. Of course, that has to be noted.
Militær magt, det skal man selvfølgelig tage ned.
Noted, but perhaps not taken as a guarantee, say geopolitical analysts.
Do you have faith that he actually thinks in his heart that he won't use force, or is that still a threat?
I wouldn't put huge weight on it if I were running one of the NATO countries, and I think they still have to make their calculations based on the fact that the US president says he very, very much wants to acquire Greenland and thinks the US ought to have it in return for all the things it's done for NATO.
NATO and its dependence on the US was a thread that ran through today's speech. What other members owe to the US for that? What Ukraine now owes the US.
What does the United States get out of all of this work, all of this money, other than death, destruction, and massive amounts of cash going to people who don't appreciate what we do? They don't appreciate what we do. I'm talking about NATO, I'm talking about Europe. They have to work on Ukraine. We don't. The United States is very far away. We have a big, beautiful ocean separating us.
Tomorrow, it was announced the president will meet Ukraine's President Zelensky here in Davos.
Thank you very much, everybody.
And his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is flying to Moscow to meet Russia's President Putin.
We plan to discuss peace in Ukraine and Russia.
And how do you think it will go?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that all meetings will go well on that subject. We need a peace.
But while they need peace in Ukraine, they need a purchase in Greenland, they say. Troops may be off the table for now, but the spectre of economic warfare still hangs over these lands, and over much of Europe too. This was a long and wide-ranging speech full of every sort of big, beautiful Trumpism. There were repeated attacks on NATO. There was a less than full grasp on detail. On 4 separate occasions, he confused Greenland with Iceland. And there were a number of, let's call them, inaccuracies. He said, quote, "After the war, we gave Greenland back to Denmark." that didn't happen. He also said the United States was paying for virtually 100% of NATO. It's estimated it was actually about 62% last year. On the substance, though, there has been annoyance on his repeated claims that the European nations aren't doing enough for their commitment to NATO. Remember, the only time that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked has been in defence of the United States after 9/11. There have also been consequences. The European Parliament's International Trade Committee tonight confirming that the EU-US trade deal has been suspended. In the last half hour, Donald Trump was asked what he was talking about, what consequences there might be for Denmark if he doesn't get what he wants. What are they? He said, quote, "You'll have to figure that out for yourself." As one diplomat said to me this evening, what we've heard today isn't what you expect from a president, it's what you expect from a 1980s mob boss.
Thanks very much, Paul. Well, joining me now from California is Leon Panetta, who was US Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. Thanks so much for joining us today. That top line of this speech, that President Trump will not use force to take Greenland, a victory for the tougher stance taken by Europe, or this was always a classic Trumpian ploy and he was never going to do that?
Well, I think as our allies, both those in Davos as well as here in the United States, we're accustomed to this kind of behavior by the president, which is basically to disrupt, to create disruption, to get a lot of attention. I'm not sure there's ever a strategy that's involved in the disruption, but he basically has taken this step to say he's going after Greenland. But the reality is that he could pay a heavy price. The fact is that the EU has suspended the EU-US trade agreement. There could be increased tariffs that impact on the American people. There's a price to be paid for this type of disruption. And I think the American people are going to feel it, and our allies in Europe will as well.
The problem is President Trump doesn't give much sense that he cares about that price.
No, I think he recognizes that when you try disruption, when you try bullying in order to try to achieve a certain goal, that you're going to use tariffs, you're going to use the threat of military action, you're going to use other threats as well. But the reality is that we have a unified Europe that has basically taken a stand here and said it's not going to happen. And that line is important because what it could mean now is a possible tariff war between the United States and Europe, which isn't going to benefit either side. So I think ultimately the president has to recognize that the last thing he wants going into an election year is to have prices go up in the United States and to have the affordability issue front and center.
I mean, when you talk about European unity, that does seem to be the picture, but only in the very recent days. I mean, for some of them, only in the last 24 hours. If you look at the way the UK's Prime Minister has tended to deal with President Trump, it has been to flatter, it has to be constantly to talk about this special relationship, no matter how rude President Trump is in return. How genuinely solid do you think the Europeans are? Because they also recognise a tariff war, tariffs are dangerous for everybody.
No, there's no question. But I also think that as a result of the United States kind of going it alone, rather than working with our allies, rather than strengthening NATO and doing what other presidents have done in our history, which is basically to try to build a strong alliance with Europe. This president wants to go it alone. And so the end result is going to be that Europe has no choice but to step up. They've done that with regards to Ukraine. I give them tremendous credit for being unified and supporting Ukraine. And now they're doing it with regards to standing up to Trump on Greenland. And that's important. You've got to draw lines on this president because he uses disruption.
Sorry to cut across you. I mean, that fracture that you are talking about, you know, that this move has exposed between the US and its NATO allies, is it fixable? I mean, we heard Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, yesterday say we're in the middle of a rupture rather than a transition. Is he right? Is the world order done now as we knew it?
Look, I think the one thing that we've learned as the president has conducted his presidency is that he makes a lot of threats. He creates a lot of disruption. But in the end, he's going to back off if he thinks that it is going to impact adversely politically here in the United States. And it's for that reason that I think that ultimately this is a president who, if he thinks it's to his advantage to work with NATO and to work with our European allies, because it will ultimately benefit our economy to do so, and I think it will, he's going to change his mind. And that's what we all kind of stand back and watch, is that he creates tremendous disruption, but then he ultimately backs off.
But isn't the truth from a European? Isn't the truth from the European perspective, from the UK's perspective, certainly, that they are inextricably linked to the US at this precise moment, that any attempt to move away to some sort of NATO Mark II could be years, if not decades away? Splitting completely, taking too tough a stand is just not possible.
Well, I think that's what Europe has to decide, whether it's going to play hardball here or whether it's going to back off. And I think Europe has decided to take a tough stand. I think that's good. I think we need to have Europe do that, because it then sends a clear signal to Trump that he's alone. And so, you know, I know everyone's concerned. I know everyone would like to be able to restore a relationship with the United States. I certainly would like to see that happen. And I'm sure our European allies would like to see that happen. But we are in a tough game right now, where if the president takes the kind of stands he's going to take and threatens to take over Greenland, then Europe and the rest of the world is going to have to be unified in standing strong against that happening. That's what has to happen.
Very briefly, if you would, Greenland is currently creating all the headlines, but of course Ukraine is an ongoing conflict. And isn't it the truth that NATO needs President Trump to stay engaged on that and on the right side of it?
Well, yeah, look, there's no question. I felt strongly that the President of the United States ought to make clear to Putin that we are going to provide weapons to Ukraine. We're going to strongly support Ukraine, because that's the kind of message that has to be given to Putin. I think this president understands that even Ukraine has made some very strong decisions to move ahead and provide its own air defense system, to move ahead and provide its own weapons of war. And that is a good sign, because it tells Putin that Ukraine is not going away.
Leon Panetta, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Thanks so much. Kathy.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, let's get the latest reaction from Washington now, and our US editor, Anushka Astana. Anushka.
If I was to describe the kind of collective response from Republicans to what they've seen from Donald Trump today, to be honest, I think it would be a sigh of relief. It's been really interesting listening to voices on Capitol Hill talking about Greenland. Loyal Republicans, yes, they stick to Donald Trump's tune on this, but they always try to ease down the rhetoric. At one point, I saw Marco Rubio in Congress, and when he was asked about this, the Secretary of State, he really tried to steer away from military force. Other Republicans have spoken out, and we've actually got Republican senators from North Carolina and from Alaska on a trip to Denmark over the weekend trying to ease tensions. But look, it is worth saying that while British sources I speak to are relieved at that as well, they still do not know what is going on with tariffs. As you were hearing there is a pause in ratification by the EU. Well, the Brits already have a trade deal with the US, and they don't know now what is happening with that. The Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, has been making reassuring noises, promising that trade deals will still stay in place. But that remains a big worry. Today, I was in the capital and I listened to Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, who has also eased off on the military rhetoric, respond to what Trump has said.
And if you look at the top of the map, as our friends in the UK call the High North, the Arctic region, it is a very strategic place for us to have a presence and military presence, to be more specific, because it would protect from aggressions from Russia and China, most specifically. The president is right to highlight that, and our NATO allies have to acknowledge those facts, and I think they do.
I thought it was interesting that Mike Johnson was talking about dialogue and he didn't actually mention the idea of ownership. Interestingly, he's just been to the UK and he said he talked to Donald Trump multiple times over the weekend. There are many who think that it was Nigel Farage talking to Mike Johnson about the Chagos Islands, which led to Donald Trump also intervening on that over the weekend, something which I should say has also led many of the British sources I speak to feel very shocked by what they've been hearing from Donald Trump.
Anushka, thanks very much. Well, we're joined from Roskilde in Denmark by the Danish MP Rasmus Jarlov, who's chair of the Defence Committee. Rasmus Jarlov, Donald Trump's backed down on military action, but he still says he wants to have Greenland, so it's a qualified relief for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good clarification that military actions are off the table, and now we will engage with dialogue with the Americans to see what we can do for them in Greenland, because there's nothing we want more than to help them with their security concerns. We don't exactly recognize all of what's being said about China being about to take over Greenland, because we haven't seen China up there. They have nothing there. There hasn't been a Chinese warship near Greenland for 10 years. So some of that is a bit exaggerated, but we are in complete agreement that we need to be able to monitor everything that's going on up there, which is also why we have invested heavily in Greenland's defense in the past years.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump paints this picture of you actually not caring very much about Greenland. You know, he says Denmark is ungrateful to the US and says the Danes don't even go to Greenland. Have you yourself been there?
Oh, I've been there like 20 times, maybe. Yes, of course, we care a lot about Greenland, and Greenlanders care a lot about Denmark. A quarter of them live in Denmark. They're Danish citizens. They speak Danish, also their own local language. And they have been with Denmark for 650 years, predating Columbus with about 100 years. So we care deeply about Greenland, which is also why we're never going to sell Greenland. That's out of the question. But the door is open for an American engagement up there as much as they want.
Well, let's talk about what happens through that door if the US is pushing on it then. Because, you know, the Reform leader in the UK, Nigel Farage, said that the world would be more secure if the US owned Greenland. Is there a sense in which a bigger military power would be better to protect Greenland from, you know, Russian or Chinese expansionism?
Absolutely not. It has worked really well with Denmark being in control of Greenland. It has kept it as a relatively low tension area. Denmark is big enough to sustain the Greenlandic society with everything that they need, and we understand them, and we have a close connection with them. So we are much, much better at that than the US would ever be. And we're small enough that we don't pose a threat to the big powers, but we have given the Americans the access that they need so they can scale up and down as much as they want in Greenland. But it has worked really well, and we have kept China and Russia completely out of Greenland. They don't own anything up there. They don't have any activities up there. There's no mining. They don't have a consulate. I normally say that it's hard to find even a Chinese restaurant in Greenland. That's how much we've kept China out. And they own a larger percentage of the United States than they own of Greenland.
Right.
So no imminent Chinese threat, and we'll continue to keep them out, because we certainly don't want Greenland to fall to Russia and China, but it's not going to.
So now an invasion is off the table. What can you concede to the US? What can you sort of entice them with in a way?
Well, we're willing to talk about most things. The two things that's mentioned often is security. And if the Americans want to open another base, they can do that. They used to have something like a presence about 30 places in Greenland. They've downscaled it completely, so they only have one base left, and only 1%, 150 soldiers, out of the 15,000 that they used to have. So that's one thing. They can scale that up as much as they want. And there's actually ghost towns in Greenland that used to be American bases. The runways are still there. The buildings are still there. They can move right in. They just have to paint the buildings maybe a little bit, but it's very easy for them to upscale their presence again. The other thing is minerals. That's talked about a lot. And here it's important to say that the Greenlanders have been looking for international investors for decades without finding any. But if the Americans are willing to put up money to extract minerals in Greenland, which is expensive because of very tough Arctic condition, it may not be the best business case always, but it's certainly something you may want to do for strategic reasons. They are so welcome. And I don't think there's anything Greenlanders want more than that.
Yeah, they could end up ruining the day. But Rasmus Jarlov, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer chose to stay in the House of Commons, not Davos, where he criticised Donald Trump for putting pressure on the UK to soften its opposition to his bid to take over Greenland. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster now. Gary.
Yes, some puzzlement around that the rather well-travelled Keir Starmer wasn't in Davos. I think that's probably because he couldn't be guaranteed FaceTime with Donald Trump there. And that would be doubly embarrassing if he'd gone all the way there and say Nigel Farage did get FaceTime. He's out there right now as well. So as you say, he did stay here for Prime Minister's questions. He'd already ratcheted up the rhetoric a little bit with Donald Trump on Monday, saying that his threat of tariffs against countries who'd sent forces to Greenland was wrong. Today he ratcheted it up even more. And he also impugned the motives of Donald Trump in using the Chagos Islands against Britain. He said it's the whole deal which preserves the American base there in Diego Garcia by giving sovereignty to Mauritius. That deal was something that Donald Trump had signed up to, and he was merely opposing it now in order to put pressure on him, Keir Starmer. Here's how the Prime Minister responded when Kemi Badenoch linked those two issues.
Does he agree that just as those in Greenland should decide their own future, so should the Chagossians?
President Trump deployed words on Chagos yesterday that were different to his previous words of welcome and support when I met him in the White House. He deployed those words yesterday for the express purpose of putting pressure on me and Britain in relation to my values and principles on the future of Greenland. Mr. Speaker, he wants me to yield on my position, and I'm not going to do so. Given that that was his express purpose, I'm surprised the Leader of the Opposition has jumped on the bandwagon.
Well, Labour MPs clocked that hardening of the tone, and quite a few of them have been saying they really rather enjoyed it. And in number 10, there's a certain amount of gloating that they feel Kemi Badenoch walked into a trap that they had set for her. But the logic of Keir Starmer's softer language in public than some other leaders with Donald Trump is that he thinks you can attract certain consequences if you ratchet up the language. And we await to see what those consequences are.
Indeed. Gary, thanks very much.